playfully mocked his strength, his reaction was instant anger and an unexpected move. It began as a joke, one of those teasing comments you make to someone you've known for decades, looking for a laugh in return. But instead, that was the moment my destroyer started. My name is Rachel. I am 32 years old, and you might think that I am here to tell you my story. Not in my wildest dreams did I think I would be the one to come here to demonstrate to you how I cheated on my husband. I got married 5 years ago to the man of my dreams, David. I never thought I would be able to cheat on him. He was everything that I wanted in my life. But you know the things you do, that is the things that you didn't expect, sometimes. I recall the day that I met David. It was at a friend's party, one of those affairs where everyone felt a little too polished, the wine served just a little too generously, conversations polite but surface level. Then he came in, tall, unpretentious, and with that warm smile that made you think you were the only person in the room. At first glance, he wasn't my type. He wasn't flashy or loud. But there was something in the way he listened when I spoke, the way he seemed to care about me, not just how I looked or what I had to say. By the end of the night, he asked me to go for coffee. That was 7 years ago. Meanwhile, our history was one of steady growth, not the whirlwind romance seen in the movies. He was the rock, the steady hand that kept me rooted. I was the catalyst, the one who thought big, who got us out of our comfort zones. Together, we built a life, a home, careers that were comfortable, and a marriage that felt unshakable. At least that was my understanding. 2 years later, we married at a vineyard in a lovely ceremony. That was the most joyful day of my life. I still remember the way David looked at me as I walked down the aisle, as if I was the only person in the world. The Latin was symbolic, and I was never able to pronounce it properly anyway. But the promises we made on our wedding day were heartfelt and sincere, to love, honor, and cherish each other as long as we both shall live. We twirled under the stars with friends and family gathered around us, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is all I wanted in my life. The first few years of married life were idyllic. We purchased an adorable home in the suburbs, decorated it together, then adopted a dog whom we named Max. We were building life, brick by brick. Somewhere along the way, though, the magic turned frigid. It wasn't really anybody's fault. Life just happened. David's career continued to advance, along with longer hours and more stress. He was ambitious, which I liked about him, but it also meant he was always distracted and tired. He'd come home late, eat dinner at the table in silence, then retreat with a laptop to the bedroom. I told myself it was a phase, that he was doing it for us. My own career, meanwhile, was stable but uninspiring. I felt stagnated, trapped in a rut of my own making that went nowhere and left me unfulfilled. David was so caught up with his work he didn't see how unhappy I was. Or maybe he did, but he didn't know what to do about it. Our talks turned practical and transactional. Did you pay the water bill? What time is your meeting tomorrow? We loved each other still, but the ignition that had fueled our union blazed no more. David worked as a project manager for a large construction company. He worked on the other side of it, just managing big projects, teams, and deadlines. He excelled professionally, and it was apparent why. He was detail-oriented, driven, and naturally gifted at command. When we first started dating, I loved how passionate he was about his job. He returned home excited about the progress his team made, or a fresh solution they'd come up with for a difficult question. But as he rose in the ranks, the pressure increased. The days did get longer, and the burden of responsibility began to weigh on him. He was preoccupied with work instead of with us, not that he intended to be. His success in his career was a mixed blessing. I was proud of him, but I also felt bitterness about the time and energy his job took from our relationship. Meanwhile, I used to be a content strategist in marketing in a mid-sized company. As part of my job, I created campaigns, managed social media, and worked with clients to develop their brand identities. It wasn't bad work, it was good paying and had its creative moments, but over time it began to feel like something I was just doing. I had gotten into marketing in the first place because I loved storytelling, but the corporate experience made everything feel transactional. Deadlines, metrics, and client demands gave scant space for the creativity I craved. Unlike David, I didn't feel that urge to climb the career ladder. I wanted balance. I wanted fulfillment, and I wanted time for the things I loved, outside of work. But since David was working all the time, I felt like I was on autopilot, both at work and at home. David's job made him proud, but it drove a wedge between us. The late nights and work trips left me lonely. My unhappiness with my own work left me restless and disparaging of the life we'd created. We were both busy, but in different senses. David threw himself into his work, and I was internally craving connection and meaning. We didn't report the little things of our days, his triumphs and tribulations, my aggravations and aspirations. David wasn't just great at his job, he was beyond great. He started in an entry-level position and rose to become a senior project manager at one of the top construction companies in the city. His projects were huge, skyscrapers, urban developments, things that would linger decades in the firmament as a monument to his diligence. Each promotion brought with it more responsibility. David's days began early and ended late. He would wake up at dawn to check emails, spend all day in meetings or at the site, and return home drained. Even in the moment he was there, being present, his brain was still working, strategizing, problem-solving, thinking about the next day. Initially, I was all in. I knew that establishing a career requires time and determination, and I was proud of him. But as months turned into years, his work took over. David's hours were brutal. Mornings crept into late nights, and the weekends weren't safe. He frequently canceled plans because something important had come up at work. Vacations were few and far between, and he would spend half of the trip on his phone or laptop anyway. I wanted to be understanding, but the loneliness was palpable. I would make dinner thinking we would eat together, and he would text me that he was running late again. Most nights I went to bed alone, with the space next to me empty and cold. Eventually, I no longer stayed up for him. It felt pointless, and that simple act, going to sleep without him, became emblematic of the widening gulf between us. It wasn't only David's time his job stole, but his energy and attention as well. When we finally had a moment together, he was almost always distracted. I'd try to tell him about my day, my frustrations, or something insignificant, but I could tell his head was somewhere else. If I confronted him on it, he'd say, "I'm doing this for us, Rachel. Don't you see that? This isn't forever." I was willing to take him at his word at first, but "not forever" began to feel like a meaningless promise. Weeks stretched into months, which turned into years. The longer it continued, the less I felt like a priority in his life. What stung the most wasn't that David was busy. It was that his work seemed to give him something that I didn't. When something went well, or he'd worked through a tough problem, he'd light up. But as for us, for me, there wasn't that spark. I began to feel like a minor character in his life, someone he could count on as a cheerleader and someone to keep the household running, but not someone he necessarily needed in his life. The ruin of our marriage had a lot to do with David's job, though that wasn't his intent. He was really passionate about what he did, and I respect him for it. It's one of the things that drew me to him. But as the years passed, the demands of his career began to overshadow everything else in his life, including us. And resentment started to build, gradually, but inevitably. I was resentful of the fact that his work stole him from me. I resented him for not struggling more to make his work and our marriage balance, and I hated myself for feeling so dependent on his attention. That is when someone else came into my life, and I let him in. Greg filled this role when he arrived on the scene. He was in marketing as well, and we worked closely on a few major projects. He knew the frustrations of my job in a way David did not. Over coffee breaks and late nights at the office, we bonded over shared experiences. Reflection now tells me that Greg wasn't the answer to my dissatisfaction. He was merely a distraction from the true issues I wasn't ready to address. If I had been honest with myself and with David, perhaps we'd have been able to return to each other. But instead, I allowed the distance to widen until it seemed unbearable. Greg worked in the marketing department at my company. He was not someone I had noticed much or interacted with much. He was in another division, so I only saw him sometimes in meetings or group projects. The first time we actually spoke was at a team brainstorming session for a big-time client campaign. Greg had this particular manner of speaking, confident but not arrogant, funny in that herky-jerky way that drew people in. I recall being impressed by how simple it was to interact with him. Following that meeting, we started talking casually in the break room. It began with small talk, work complaints, favorite restaurants, and TV shows. But there was something about him that caused those conversations to keep going just a little bit past the appropriate endpoint. It wasn't one moment that shifted things between us. It was a series of little moments. We began having lunch together with coworkers at times, but more often the two of us. It seemed innocuous, two people just sharing a meal, but those lunches became something I looked forward to. Greg was funny and attentive and made me feel interesting and valued in a way I hadn't felt in years. We were assigned to work together on a major campaign. Those long hours together, driven by coffee and collective outrage, bonded us. We'd laugh at how absurd our deadlines were or commiserate about difficult clients. At some point along the way, the line between professional and personal began to fade. Greg knew how to see things that David did not. He'd praise my ideas, my outfits, even how I arranged my hair. At first it seemed innocent, a slight tickle to my ego. But eventually I found that I wanted those compliments. We began to hold conversations outside of work. It started with work-related texts, about projects, reminders about meetings, but quickly they turned more personal. He would send me jokes or memes that he thought I would enjoy. I'd reply with anecdotes about my day or words that came to mind. One night, after yet another late night at the office, we were getting ready to leave. It was just the two of us, and the office was quiet, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights. "You work too hard, you know that?" Greg said as he leaned against the edge of my desk. I laughed. "Coming from you?" "Seriously, no," he said, his tone taking on a gentler note. "You deserve more than this. It is more than just work all the time." There was something in the way he looked at me, sincere, almost vulnerable. It caught me off guard. "Thanks," I said, and didn't know what else to say. Before I could realize it, he reached out and pushed a hair off my face. It was a minor gesture, but it felt charged. I didn't stop him when his hand hesitated or when he leaned in. That was the first time we kissed. Following that encounter, events turned dramatic at a faster pace. While we didn't go straight into an affair, the lines had been erased. We started looking for more chances to be together, spending more time at work for unnecessary reasons, or going out for a drink after work. I tried to tell myself that things were not as serious. Greg wasn't a threat to my marriage. He was just a distraction, someone who made me feel alive again. I told myself that I wasn't hurting anyone, that David wouldn't notice, and that I deserved to be happy after all those lonely days. Nonetheless, at some corner of my brain, I knew it was not proper. Every time I turned to see David, I felt a twang of guilt, and every time I gazed upon Greg, I felt a rush of excitement I couldn't resist. It is pretty much the same. I knew it was wrong, but every single moment David would come into sight, I would feel a little tug of guilt. Then again, every time I had Greg before my eyes, excitement soared through me in a way that left me having no control at all. Looking back, I realize I turned to Greg because he temporarily filled a void I didn't want to confront. My marriage had turned into a source of pain and frustration, a source of difficulty, and rather than face those feelings down in David, I ran away from them. Greg was available, approachable, and able to provide me with the attention I longed for. He came without the baggage of our shared history or the pressures of a long-term arrangement. With him, I could forget my life and pretend, if only for a few hours, that I was somebody else, somebody happy and wanted and carefree. But the reality was, the affair had nothing to do with Greg. It was about me and the cracks in my marriage that I couldn't figure out how to fix. And by the time I figured that out, the damage had already been done. David and I had been having a rough patch for a little while, but I figured it was work stress on his part. I didn't think he knew about Greg, not yet. David wasn't the kind of guy to blow up in anger or demand answers. He had always kept his emotions very much in check, so it was easy to believe he'd somehow not noticed the changes between us. The cracks started to show day by day, but still I thought he didn't know anything about Greg, until one night we were staying home and watching TV. It was a joke, one of those playful jabs you exchange as someone who has known someone else for years to invoke laughter back. We were in the kitchen, the smell of dinner lingering. I was standing at the counter watching David struggle to open a jar of pickles. "Oh, get out of here," I said, smiling. "All that time in the weight room and you can't pull this off? Maybe I should call Greg. He never has a problem with jars." I don't know why I said it. Maybe it was the wine. Perhaps it was the guilt eating away at my insides, the secret I'd been holding for months. But the moment the words escaped my mouth, I realized I'd gone too far. David froze. His knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the jar. When he looked at me, his face was a mix of shock and something darker, something I hadn't seen before. I shrugged, attempting to shake it off. I was kidding. But he wasn't laughing. Instead, he placed the jar on the counter carefully and stepped toward me. You think this is funny? Mocking me in my own home? I was just kidding, I said, but my voice quavered. His response wasn't what I anticipated. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. Instead, he took the jar back, twisted off the lid in one sharp move, and slammed it down on the counter. The sound rang through the room in silence. Then he looked at me, really looked at me. What's going on, Rachel? I froze. The air between us became suddenly thick. Nothing, I said too quickly, not looking him in the eye. His voice dropped lower. Don't lie to me. And at that moment, I understood he knew. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to make me question the times I'd come home late. Enough to question the weekends I'd spent with friends. Enough to question what had made me aloof, preoccupied, and too quick to snarl. David didn't discover the truth about my affair by accident. It was a long, intentional unearthing, like tugging at one thread until the whole fabric tore. And the manner in which he learned it was much more dramatic than I ever would have envisioned. It started small, with discrepancies that defied logic. David was not the sort to monitor my phone or question me about where I'd been. He trusted me, or at least he did. But even the most trusting person cannot discount a gut feeling. I started coming home later than usual and saying I had work deadlines or team events. My phone, which previously might have sat untouched on the kitchen counter or on the nightstand without so much as a second look, was now never more than a few paces away and face down. I wasn't as careful as I needed to be, giggling over Greg's messages a little too loud, texting in the middle of the night, or stepping into another part of the room to take a call. David noticed. He didn't call me out on it immediately. Instead, he observed, listened, and waited. One evening, I told David I had a late meeting. In fact, I was meeting Greg at a cozy little bistro across town. We'd picked it precisely because it was far enough from home to avoid running into someone we knew. Or so I thought. That evening, David arrived home early to an empty house. The meeting hadn't sat well. Something about how I hadn't even looked him in the eye when I rushed out the door had raised alarms. On a whim, or perhaps instinct, he took a drive. He wasn't coming looking for me. He just had to clear his head. But when he walked by the restaurant, something caught his eye. There I was, sitting by the window, laughing and leaning into Greg. My hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture so familiar but so foreign to the man watching from his car. David parked and stared through the glass for a long time. He didn't barge in or make a fuss. That wasn't his style. Instead, he took out his phone and took a picture of us, the camera's flash invisible in the low light of the restaurant. David started putting together the puzzle the following day. He started cross-referencing the nights. I'd said I was working late with our shared calendar and the location sharing feature on my phone that I'd forgotten I had turned on. Soon enough, he had the evidence that he needed, texts and photos, location logs, that told a damning story. Upon learning of the affair, David did not act rashly. That wasn't his way. Rather, he used his anger and heartbreak to engineer a methodical plan, a means to ensure I felt the consequences of my betrayal in complete measure. He wanted me to feel the humiliation, the pain, the helplessness that he felt. David began gathering evidence not for himself, but because he understood that it would give him leverage. The restaurant photo of Greg and I was just the start. He combed through months of phone bills, searched my social media for inconsistencies, and printed out screenshots of our texts and location logs. But knowing wasn't enough for him. He wanted to take apart the life I had taken for granted, bit by bit, without me ever smoothing away the confusion of the process. David slowly started stepping back from our mutual friends. He contacted our closest friends and family, giving just enough details to show me in an unfavorable light. He didn't raise his voice or blame anyone. He just confided, as he put it, to them, positioning himself as the wounded, faithful spouse who had been trying to piece together what had gone wrong. Centralized data is not free. It comes at a cost, and you may only realize it when it is too late, like me. Invitations to dinners and parties dried up, and mutual friends started giving me the side eye. David had taken care of most of our finances, and I never thought twice about it. Now, he leveraged that control of his to his benefit. He transferred money from our joint account to a private one, leaving only a small amount behind to cover bare costs so I wouldn't notice right away. He also revoked my access to our credit cards, saying there had been suspicious activity on the accounts. When I attempted to use them, they were rejected, leaving me dependent on my meager funds. David knew about the big campaign I was working on with Greg, the one that had first brought us together. He never confronted Greg outright, but he used subterfuge to undermine me and my work. David, with the contacts he had in his own network, spread rumors about my reliability and professionalism, working to ensure my name was dirtied to just the right extent, making my position precarious. David's vengeance wasn't only about destroying my life, it was about forcing me to reckon with my own stability. He stopped connecting with me emotionally. Conversations also became transactional, reduced to logistics concerning the house or bills. He didn't scream, didn't cry. He just retreated, leaving me to sit in my own suffocating silence of guilt. Soon David began leaving little reminders of what he knew around the house, a hard copy of our texts on the nightstand. A note that read, "Dinner at our restaurant tonight, taped to the fridge." My stomach dropped every time I found one of these. It was his way of reminding me he was always one step ahead, that he hadn't forgotten, and that he was in control. David's revenge was ruthless and meticulous, a dinner with my parents and a handful of close friends. He said we had to host because of appearances. I felt relieved. I thought he was trying to move on. The evening began innocently enough. David was a perfect host, delightful and gracious, and I tried to pretend to myself that the tension between us wasn't gnawing. But when dessert came, he rose and porcelain tapped his glass for attention. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said, his tone steady and measured. "I've been in some bad times lately, and I couldn't have done it without your support." I turned to him, our eyes met. "And Rachel, I want to thank you too, for teaching me an important lesson." I froze, the fork clattering onto my plate. "You see," he went on, explaining to the room, "Rachel has been teaching me what it means to be selfless, taking our marriage and sacrificing it for someone else's happiness." Gasps swept around the table. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father's face went beet red. "David, don't," I whispered, trembling. He ignored me, opening up a folder. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but I believe everyone deserves to see the truth." Inside the folder were copies of the texts, the photo from the restaurant, and a detailed timeline of my lies. He circulated it around the table, his face impassive as the room erupted into a frenzy. "You thought I was too weak to see," he said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "Too distracted, too naive. You thought you could make a fool of me, lie to me, and I'd just never figure it out. But let me tell you something, Rachel. Strength isn't measured by how much you can lift, or by how many arguments you can win. Strength is knowing when to walk away from the people who don't value you." My face burned as I scanned the table. My parents looked at me horrified. My friends tossed awkward glances, and David preached, every word a hammer strike. He stepped closer, his voice lowered but still heard by everyone. "You called me weak, Rachel, but let's be frank. Weakness is cheating on the one who made you whole. Lying to oneself and those around oneself is weakness. If that's what strength looks like, I'll gladly have my so-called weakness any day." With that, he slammed the folder on the table, the sound echoing like a gavel condemning me. That night, David left with his head held high, punting the destruction he meticulously left behind back into my court. His remarks on strength rang in my ears long after he was dead, echoing the folly of having underestimated him and ruined everything we held dear. It wasn't just the affair or the lies that had driven him to this point. It was how I'd mocked him, belittled him, and taken his quiet persistence for granted. And ultimately, David had proved to me just how invincible he was. When David began to disclose the affair at the table that night, the response from my parents and dearest friends broke me more than anything he could have said or done. Watching their expressions change from confusion to horror, then to anger and disappointment, was like being naked in front of everyone I cared about. My mother was the first to respond. Her face went pale, and she looked at me as if I were a stranger. She covered her mouth, her voice shaking. "Rachel," she said, the volume barely above a whisper, "is this true? Did you cheat on David?" I couldn't look at her. I wanted to deny it, to dismiss it somehow, but I couldn't find the words. I saw tears fill her eyes, and the familiar look of pride she'd always had in me changed to pure heartbreak. My dad wasn't as restrained. He banged his hand down so forcefully on the table that the plates and glasses rattled. "You would not believe," was all he said, his voice like ice. "David has done nothing but good to you. Shame on you, Rachel, for doing this. To him, to us." I tried to say something, but it felt as though my throat had sealed. My dad shook his head, disgust written all over his face. "You've embarrassed yourself, and us." His words landed like a gut punch. I had never seen my dad so mad, so disappointed. Still, after that, he wouldn't even look at me. I looked to my friends, thirsting for a little understanding, but they had my parents' faces. My best friend Jessica, who had supported me through everything, just looked at me in disbelief. "Rachel," she said, her voice hard but trembling, "why didn't you tell me? I thought we told each other everything. You've lied to me too, haven't you?" Her words cut almost as deeply as David's. I had always leaned on Jessica, but all of a sudden I saw the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal she felt, not only for what I'd done to David, but for the lies I'd told her too. Mark, who had always been tight with David, didn't even bother to disguise his anger. "To be honest with you, Rachel, this is disgusting. David doesn't deserve this. None of us believed you were this type of person." His words felt like a slap. I have always thought of myself as a person they respect, a person they admire, but now all I saw in their faces was judgment and disdain. The fallout in the days that followed was worse still. My mother and father said little to me. My dad ignored my calls, and when I eventually appeared at their house, he looked at me like I was some stranger. "Do you even know what you've done?" he said, his voice cold. "Not only to David, but to us, to this family." My mother was gentler but no less devastated. She hugged me for a moment, but I felt the pause in her arms, as if she didn't know how to comfort someone who had caused other people so much pain. As for my friends, Jessica stopped responding to my texts. When I finally put it to her, she simply shook her head. "I can't believe you lied to me," she said. "How could you do that to David and keep it from me? I don't even know who you are anymore." Mark was even more direct. "You were the one who wrecked it all, Rachel. Someone you can't expect to clean up after you." I had always taken their love and support for granted, assuming they would always be there, no matter what. But once I was here and sat alone in the quiet of my house, the reality of what I'd done finally hit me. I hadn't just betrayed David, I had broken the trust of everyone I loved. And now, as everyone distanced themselves, I understood that I might never regain that trust. This is the story of my miserable life. Please go easy on me, as Adele says. Thank you for reading my story, Rachel. Update. Hello guys, I am Rachel. Here I am again because you have noticed there were gaps in my story, and so I will give an update of my story and my life. In this article, after my divorce, my life became a mere imitation of what it once was. The bright, bustling world I once inhabited, filled with love, friends, happiness, and security, was replaced by a lonely existence I could hardly recognize. David kept the house. Of course he did. It had been his before we married, and his lawyer ensured that the settlement left me with only the basics. I was not in a position to rent anything even close to what we had shared, so I was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a dark and dingy place, the sort of apartment where the walls always felt frigid and damp, and every step forced the floor to creak. The neighbors were noisy, and the sounds of shouting or blaring TVs made their way through the thin walls. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, and tormented by the silence that once resonated with David's steady presence. The fallout from my affair didn't only wreck my personal life, it undermined my career. David's silent sabotage had sown seeds of doubt about my professionalism. Clients began withdrawing from projects, and I was personally tarnished in the industry. When Greg pulled away after the confrontation, I lost not only a lover, but a crucial link at work. I was no longer necessary, and I was gone within months. I was stuck in a boring administrative job at a small, nondescript company. The pay barely paid for rent and food, and the work was soul-sapping. I went from running campaigns to running someone else's calendar, a daily reminder of how far I'd fallen. I can't pretend I at least found some peace or some redemption, but the truth is, I was miserable. Regret had become my second skin, and it weighed on me, moment by moment, day after day. I relived every mistake, every lie, every cruel word I had uttered to David over and over in my head. The quiet in my apartment was unbearable. On some nights, I'd fill a glass with cheap wine and look at old photos of us, thinking about how I had let it all fade away. David, in contrast, appeared to thrive. He moved on fast, or so it seemed from the glimpses I caught through mutual friends and social media. He immersed himself in work, earning a promotion and traveling to places we'd once hoped to travel together. Then he began dating someone new, a woman who seemed to represent everything I wasn't. She was kind, supportive, and by all accounts, head over heels in love with him. They had moved into our old house and redecorated it in fantastic ways I could only dream of. Witnessing him flourish while I floundered was punishment of a different kind. My life is now a long, unending punishment, a daily reminder of every error I made and the life that I flushed down the toilet. Every morning I wake up in this dank, one-bedroom apartment with a faint smell of mildew, the wallpaper peeling in spots. The heater hardly works, and the chill seeps into my bones so that it's difficult even to get out of bed. The mornings are the worst. I lay on my back and stare up at the ceiling, knowing I have nothing to look forward to. My alarm clock blares to jolt me awake, not that I need it, I've been up for hours, but to shoo me along into what feels like yet another day of the same. The guilt is constant. It is a persistent ache that does not let up, an almost physical sensation pressing down on my chest. I replay it all in my mind, the lies I said, the way I belittled David, the decisions that got me in this position. Sometimes I hear David's voice in my head, reminding me of what I said about his strength. His breezy, shredding words haunt me, particularly how he told me I was the weak one. He was right. I am weak. I sit on the couch with a glass of low-priced Chablis, scrolling through old pictures of David and me and wondering how I let it all slip away. Sometimes I cry myself to sleep, hugging a pillow and wishing it was him, but the crying doesn't change anything. The isolation is crushing, and there's no one to blame but me. I still keep myself updated about David's life. Friends still write about him, tagging him in photos with his new girlfriend. She's everything I am not. Kind, supportive, someone who encourages him instead of belittling him. They seem happy together, posing in front of what was once our house, redecorated with her decor. Like I was never even there, a mere blip in his narrative. This is my life now, empty and lonely and cold. Every day reminds me of what I had and what I lost. I'm not living, I'm surviving. And the worst part, I know I did this to myself. He wasn't weak as I playfully mocked him to be. He was instead very strong. He took his revenge, and I deserved everything. Thank you to everyone for reading my story. Rachel.